Although you'll probably hear too much of me. Jen Goldsack, I'm the Executive Director of the Digital Medicine Society. So Elena, sorry to put you on the spot there. I'm just going to whiz down my list here. Silas, you're next.
Good afternoon. So sorry I missed our first session. Silas Buchanan, I am the founding CEO of the Institute for eHealth Equity. As the name infers, eHealth equity concerned, frankly, about an exacerbation of health disparities because of technology. So we spend quite a bit of time raising the literacy around the benefits of adopting and utilizing technology in underserved communities and communities of color. And we spend quite a bit of time with the ideators and innovators of health tech solutions, assuring that what they bring to market has a multicultural marketing plan and a deeper understanding of how best to engage with targeted communities. Lastly, I'll just pop in that we recently partnered with the AME Church, which is the largest mainline historically Black denomination in the world, 2,000 congregations and 2 million members. And we are standing up AMEC for AME Church, amechealth.org for them. Two components of that. One is community facing, and the back end is a social network just for their health ministers and health ministries. So there are some unique opportunities that I think may present themselves with the work that you guys are doing here.
Silas, that's fantastic. I scribbled down the URL and we'll make sure we sort of capture that in the notes. Also, thank you for a very thoughtful introduction. That was important because you missed this morning. As I whiz through the rest of the list, folks, I'm just going to ask you to do name, title, institution if we can, because we have a lot to discuss and I want to make sure we linger there. But Silas, welcome. Thank you. Adrian, you're next. Adrian, you're on mute. You might, I'm always conscious that folks may have stepped away, especially our clinical colleagues. Andrea, why don't you go next?
Hi, I'm Andrea Cunha. I'm the chief editor of a new open access journal from Nature Research that is called Communications Medicine.
Lovely. Thanks for being here. Chris, you're next.
Hi again, Jen. Chris Yu, CTO of Systems Oncology and a member of the planning committee.
Lovely. Thanks, Chris. And everyone's like, hello again. I'm sorry, everyone. You're stuck with me. You're very patient. We will get to our discussion. Doris, you're next.
Doris Brown, past president of the National Medical Association,
Lovely.
Oldest professional group.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. Thanks, Doris. Lani, you're next.
Lana Skirball, VP for Science Policy at Sanofi and former Director of Policy at the NIH.
Lovely, thank you. Lynn.
Lynn Matrisian, Chief Science Officer at the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network.
Lovely. Marina, would you mind going next? Oh, Marina, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we've got you.
Yep, Marina Kozak, health scientist at BARDA with HHS.
Terrific, welcome. Barry, would you like to go next?
Sure. Barry Kohler, I'm physician-in-chief at Rockefeller University.
Thank you. Elliot?
I'm recently head of clinical development at Amgen and then currently the head of R&D strategy and operations.
Lovely, thank you. Jay?
Jay Siegel, I'm semi-retired, formerly Chief Biotechnology Officer and Head of Science, Strategy and Policy for Johnson & Johnson, and before J&J, 20 years at FDA.
Lovely, thanks Jay. Celia?
Celia Witten, Deputy Director of CBIRD, FDA.
Lovely, and the question I hate, who did I miss? Okay, I'm getting better at this, which you'll all be pleased to hear. And I do also think I have screen sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and share a document I have for us to discuss. So our goal here is to think about what is absolutely critical with goal-wise. What do we need to hold ourselves accountable to in order to truly build out a resilient, a sustainable, and a transparent clinical trials enterprise? And for folks who may only be dialing in, I'll give voice to these really quickly. Some goals to consider and some goals for us to discuss. would be to improve community engagement, transparency, and user-friendliness to foster trust, counter misinformation, and meet the needs of patients. Another goal could be to reduce complexity and to streamline trials and trial startup to standardized key data elements. To support regulatory robustness, flexibility, and built-in ability to adjust, for example, during times of stress, and how to handle new technologies robustly. To reduce the conduction of uninformative, and we just heard a little bit about that, clinical trials, and prioritize resources to robustly designed trials. To generate a larger amount of high quality evidence at a lower cost. To reduce risk aversion, to improve research questions and trial design innovation. We could potentially think about embracing novel statistical techniques to power trials. We could also consider connecting and embedding clinical care and clinical research. So it's quite a list, but it's quite a goal to think about establishing a resilient, sustainable, transparent system. Let me throw it open to the floor and see if any of these goals seem particularly important, if any of them seem out of place, or if there's anything that seems to be conspicuous by its absence. I'm stopping myself. Wait, I'm a terrible, terrible moderator. I need to put someone on the spot first to serve as rapporteur. Do I have a generous volunteer to give some voice to the discussion we're about to have?
I'd be happy to do that.
Celia, thank you. I really appreciate that.
I also have one small comment on these goals.
Absolutely perfect. That's a nice transition. Please dive in.
Yes, just similar to the comment that someone made at the roundup for the prior discussion, we should also be, as we talk about this, consider if there's special considerations for rare diseases or pediatrics. So I think all of these goals are important, but some of them in particular, like the fourth goal, may really, be particularly important in the rare disease area, and some of the others perhaps less so.
Celia, that's a really terrific point, and maybe we can dig into this a little bit. This is, it's interesting you say, and I'm inclined to agree. You see this list and you want to say, yes, of course we should be doing all of these things, these should be our goals. But I sometimes wonder if a list as long as this, while it feels necessary, could be overwhelming. And I like how you teased out the value in potentially having as a primary focus, or one of our primary focuses, as sort of reducing the conduction of uninformative trials, mostly because that would be a goal that we know would have real impact across different communities that we try and serve through clinical trials. And I wonder if anyone sort of would like to react to that, or if there are other goals that could have outsized impact if we prioritize them.
Well, can I speak?
Yep, I've got you, Elliot.
So I think one thing that's missing from the list is exactly what Janet Woodcock asked us to work on, which is the establishment of community-based research networks that can serve as a platform for rapid interrogation of both chronic disease today and emerging health problems in the future. She has been talking about that for over a decade. I share her belief that is extraordinarily important. It doesn't really appear on this list.
Elliot, can I follow up to that, and yeah, to you and the full group? And I thought this, Doris, actually after some of your excellent comments this morning as well, which is you can tell I didn't grow up here. When I first started working in health research over here, community-based participatory research was all everyone was talking about. And it was well over a decade ago now. And Elliot, you just sort of said, Janet Woodcock's been talking about this for over a decade. So if we don't want to just sit here and talk about it again and drag that into a second decade, what do we have to do? What is required? What are the building blocks? What are the incentives? Where does the responsibility lie to make sure that when we come back, all a little bit older, a bit grayer, hopefully more of us, Jay in partial retirement, How do we make sure we're not still having this conversation?
Well, I think that, this is Jay, I think that part of the answer to that, and I certainly agree, that's what was in my mind as well, that there isn't mention of trial networks here. You know, I think that the answer to your specific question is that it requires funding and impetus from a central trusted source, most typically the federal government. There have been, with varying success, but in general quite important in drug development over the last few decades, some networks and for specific diseases, for HIV and cancers and the like, and those networks greatly facilitate the ability to do heart disease, to do multi-center trials in those areas. So it's not a new concept. Janet was specifically speaking to it in the context of two things. One is being there when a public health emergency like COVID arises, and being there in between such emergencies to address otherwise undermet needs. For example, some of the chronic diseases for which someone pointed out there are not strong financial incentives to research. But I think where you start is with federal money and with people usually coordinated by the NIH to make such with help. It can be the FDA can play a role, many groups can play a role depending on the network. It's CDC if it's going to be dealing with outbreaks and the like. But that's where it would come from.
Yeah, I would agree that this is one of 3 or 4 dominant themes that would require a decade-long effort with a plan, funding, and a step-by-step approach. Because it's going to require that sort of effort. I think it involves a movement of the locus of research away from the academic centers into the community where patients reside and where there are significant obstacles to the conduct of research.
I think it's also important to think about how NIH is funded. When you talk about government funding, NIH is funded by institute. Very little overarching money there. And as a result, we do have, as Jay mentioned, a lot of NIH-funded research centers by therapeutic area. NCI, NHLBI, they all have their own. But a connected research enterprise does not lend itself to the current way NIH is governed or funded.
Well, this is Doris. Again, I think what you're saying is really true, but the elephant in the room that we have to address when you're talking about engaging communities is structural racism that must really be focused on if we're going to get rid of that. And then we have to do collaborations. When you talk about funding should come not just from the government, but also from industry, because we all have a stakeholder capacity in getting good research out that is going to involve all of us. And since we've been talking about this for 10 years, it's time now to say, let's move the needle and put it into an actionable step that won't take another 10 years. And I think COVID has really moved this up to the forefront where we are beginning to see how unprepared we are. And so this is the time that we say, let's move the needle. Let's look at institutions that have built in and for generations the unconscious bias or biasness that's there, and remove that. And whether it is putting in the financial incentives that's there, but also collaboration.
This is Silas. Doris, of course, I've got to absolutely agree with that. For me, however, dealing with systemic racism or removing it from systems where it's been so deeply embedded for so many years, I would liken it to removing flour from a knot of well-kneaded bread dough, right? How are you going to do that? And so, I like to focus on how we stand up culturally appropriate, linguistically accurate systems alongside of some existing systems. Maybe we can walk and chew gum at the same time, because we know that the messenger matters as much, if not more than the message many times, right? And if the government is the one that is not just funding, but also promoting or presenting something, when you land in certain communities and you say, hey, we're here from the government and we're here to help you. Okay, we're running a completely different direction, right? So, so how do you engage trust brokers that are historically trusted in communities, co-brand something that is a bit more equitable, that stands alongside of these existing systems while we work on removing or addressing the systemic racism that exists within them?
Yeah, can I just give you one example? And this is not to step on any toes, but it's facts. We have drugs that have come before the FDA where industry has talked about recruiting a minority participation and having the numbers there, yet they present their data. It is not there. Their feet are not held to the fire. Those drugs get approved and they say, we'll collect it post-marketing. That is inappropriate to continue to do those kinds of things. So you have to go back to say, you don't have the data. Here's some steps that you need to take to get that data before I can approve it, to allow you to move forward, to say post-marketing data is going to be good enough. And then you get a black box put on a drug or a product. So there should be something to say, if you don't have it and you promise this in your preliminary data, how do we hold the feet to the fire? What is the consequences? And so now we keep generating SOS and there's no consequences. So why do I bother? And I'm sorry if I stepped on someone's toes, but I've dealt with this for a number of years.
I think, Doris, you've shone the light on something really important, which is we need to have appropriate incentives in place, right? There needs to be funding, there needs to be mechanisms, there need to be appropriate incentives. Silas, I want to go back to and riff off a little bit something that you said with the whole sort of the walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And that seems, given the transformation we're looking for, almost exactly essential to be trying to sort of transform what already exists, plus add new sort of levers or prongs or however we want to describe it. And I'm going to take a step back before we sort of dive back into our goals. I'm curious to think about how would you all define the clinical trials enterprise in a future state? Because it's interesting, we're starting to talk about community organizations. Full disclosure, come sort of always thinking about what's the appropriate level of use of technology? Not we must shoehorn technology into all of the things, but what's the appropriate gap where technology could be helpful? How do we think about what the clinical trials enterprise even is? Because that may help us with our goals. And I wonder if anyone has any sort of remarks along those lines.
I would just add to what you're talking about. I still see the transition, let's say, from what it is now, from the pharma companies developing proposals and I'll say a team of experts, researchers, mostly academic, right? Applying for those proposals. I do think the transition is, how do you ensure more community engagement to the communities in our societies that matter for the disease? Diabetes should have more Latino and African Americans. That's just there might be some diseases that are just more African American, but at any rate, the community engagement is what I think we're focused on here, on how to have high quality researchers that are community engaged, whether it's connecting a training component with community health centers, with HBCUs, with private doctors that are called community doctors, I'll just say, that are not academic, and that may be in large medical groups already, in large health systems, they're just not utilized because everybody thinks that all the Spanish-speaking doctors should see all the Spanish-speaking patients and not get involved in research. So I think that transition is what we're talking about. And I think that maybe there's some, I don't want to say requirement, maybe some brownie points like the government does with their grants to include partnerships. And I do believe there needs to be some training and mentoring, which I said earlier. There has to be some transition to get to the next level. 'Cause otherwise, we're going to stay in the same boat, like Doris mentioned, for 10 years.
I think that's really insightful. So I want to, Celia, you teased out one of the goals, which was really important, which was sort of reducing the conduct of these more sort of, frankly, uninformative, right? We want it, as a start, we need to become more efficient and start sort of being better stewards of our existing resources. Elliot, you highlighted, and a lot of folks have sort of supported, the need to have a community-based sort of system to augment and become a preferred future state of the enterprise itself. And then as we think about things like resilience, for example, we need to make sure that we have, a clinical trials workforce that better represents the patients we're all here to serve, and that the full breadth of sort of patients are represented. That's how we'll be resilient. That's how we'll be sustainable. One of the things I wanted to tease, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was maybe hinting at something even a bit more radical, which is that we'll establish platforms, disease-specific platforms, where preferentially investigational agents are studied. So, let's take myeloma as an example, where, the 100,000 US patients are being sought to participate in dozens, if not hundreds of different trials. We would, ideally like to evolve such that there are standard platforms where these new therapies are evaluated in each of the lines of therapy in a way that's far more efficient and patient-friendly and inclusive than it is today. And where it would require that the individual developers of these medicines, recognize that their interest lies in a better process, even if it means foregoing some degrees of freedom and control over the exact conditions of the experiments. So, and I think that's very much aligned with Dr. Woodcock's comments as well. And it would require a fundamental transformation of the clinical research enterprise, but I quite frankly think it's long overdue.
This is Lana. One of the things I'm having difficulty with in the conversation is we're talking about clinical research as though it's one thing. And there are many different kinds of clinical research and investigators. We seem to be flipping back and forth between industry and academia, between trials associated with product development and trials that may be involved in just understanding the etiology of disease. And the needs of these kinds of trials are quite different. So I just would caution us not to consider clinical trials a single behemoth that can be solved with one approach.
Well, to that point, and to the comment earlier about reducing the conduct of uninformative trials, I must say, watching the whole pandemic unfold, one of the more painful aspects was seeing, hundreds of investigators start up their 10-person hydroxychloroquine trial, and dozens of governors saying they're going to spend their state money funding such trials in their state. Clearly, that needs to be centralized. But one of the issues we have to come to grips with as we prioritize and centralize is an issue we discussed earlier today, which is how do you make career paths for academicians? Because if you're, one of 500 investigators on a trial that's being planned by a small central steering committee, you're not getting the type of publication or showing the type of scientific creativity that is required by most research universities for tenure. That means we also need to think about more career paths, and that gets into I think what Lana was talking about in part two, because there are, not all trialists need to be academicians. There need to be different career paths in academics, but there also need to be career paths for community-based physicians to participate in multi-center trials and to have appropriate incentives and career rewards for doing so. So there just needs to be, a lot of rethinking of how to make all of that play together to get where we need to be.
This is Barry.
Oh, Barry, go ahead. And then we've got a couple of questions come in from folks who are streaming. I want to make sure we have time for that. But Barry, go ahead first, please.
Well, I think Dr. Woodcock appropriately threw down the gauntlet. And I think that what she said is absolutely true. And we definitely need community practice-based networks available to be able to respond in real time. As she pointed out, we didn't do as well as we could with our current structure. So I couldn't agree more with that. And if the government decides to make that a priority as part of its public health infrastructure, I think that we can do that. And it doesn't necessarily mean academics are removed from that process. As I mentioned before, we cherish our partnership with the Clinical Directors Network, which is a practice-based research network. So we work hand in glove with them. And I think those partnerships should be strengthened. I would reemphasize though what Lana said, and that is that clearly is what we needed in the last year. Whether or not that is the easiest way to get to regulatory approval, I think is much more complicated. And it would be good to have a dialogue with the FDA about the regulatory process for approval and to see how that fits into that, or whether or not that still will require much more. Because if you work and just comment that the key thing to be successful, I believe, in working in practice-based research networks is to minimize the impact on patient workflow. That works for some things, but it may not work for all the types of trials that need to be done. So I think that we do have to have a variety of different options available to fit the goals of the research project. And especially it has to be aligned with the regulatory process.
It's Adrian. So at DCRI, we actually often find our most successful participating sites are actually at non-academic centers that I know is a theme on this. But over time, that's changed in terms of places not being able to participate because either the burden from sponsors in terms of what they fear may be needed for regulatory approval, not just from the US, but somewhere else. And so that's also a challenge here. And the second thing is that with competing demands, especially with increasing necessary pressures on healthcare delivery and the finances there, that people make choices. And so I think we have to get kind of, I would just say, the clutter out of trials and also get it part of the workflow. We've gotten into like a defensive medicine process for defensive research here.
That's a great point, Adrian. I'm going to read one very quick comment from the chat, and then I think we'll be transported back. So there's a really nice comment that says there's a difference between conducting community-based participatory research and investing in an infrastructure of a community network of practitioners who live in the community and can conduct the trials. Both are needed, but the latter is critical. I agree that NIH needs to fund this. There was also another lovely question. I apologize, we didn't have time to get to it, but thank you so much, everyone. Celia, thank you for being willing to do Report Out, and I'll see you back in the main room.